Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Traci Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. Don't forget to rate, review, subscribe, give this video a thumbs up wherever you're watching or listening to this. If you're listening, then just follow, review, subscribe, whatever you've got to do, depending on where you're catching the episode. And if you're on YouTube, give the video a thumbs up. Like I said, anyway, appreciate your engagement on these episodes. Thank you so much. And last week, I kind of queued us up with an audio-only episode about resume trends, and I asked for Q&A and really your questions so that I can answer them. So that is the Q&A, essentially. And so I have some questions queued up here, and I just want to mention before we get into it that the idea behind this episode is that I want to be able to give all of you kind of the tools and maybe some resources or some tools and resources that you can leverage as you are updating your resume or even kind of exploring potentially applying for new jobs. And one of the things I should mention too is that I'm getting a lot of feedback that the job market is kind of crazy. And I get that. I think it is kind of crazy, but I also think that there are a lot of jobs out there. So that said, if there are a lot of jobs out there, you do want to make sure that your resume is as picture perfect as possible. Obviously, perfection does not exist, but if you can get as close to perfection as possible, then you're going to be in a better position to hopefully get an interview and then even more hopefully land the job that you want. I actually think that it's harder to get an interview than it is to get the job. Of course, getting the job is difficult. None of this is easy, but getting an interview is arguably like the hardest part. And once you've gotten an interview, then the rest is kind of in your control. I think that's really what it comes down to, is like getting the interview is in some ways outside of your control. Like it's in your control in that your resume can be good or bad. But it's really outside of your control because it has to go through so many hoops. Like it has to be seen, it has to be reviewed, it has to be passed through. Like there's just so much. And then ultimately, like once you are selected or, given an opportunity to interview, then the ball is kind of in your court. So I should have mentioned last week in the quick overview of resume trends that first and foremost, you should always make sure that your resume accurately reflects the true experience and expertise that you have. I have seen on more than a dozen occasions where someone has embellished, let's say, their experience or their background, and it just never ends well. Like the experience that you inevitably will have once you get into that company, if you are offered a job, is not going to be that great because you're going to be expected to do, let's say, X and you're only able to do Y. And that could be a very different, expectation than what the company has for you. And it's just, you only get one reputation in a way. Certainly there are people who can kind of ebb and flow in their reputations and get kicked down and pick themselves back up. That's fine. But most of the time, especially in HR, I feel like, and I should say, especially in certain industries, if you make a bad name for yourself, it's kind of hard to break away from. So my first piece of advice is really to make sure that you don't over embellish. Sometimes you add some color and creative liberties, but if you're saying that you're able to do one thing and you've never had experience in it, and then your new company asks for your guidance on it because you said that you have experience, it's going to be an awkward thing. So don't over embellish. You can add some color, but I would not over embellish. Okay. I'm going to jump right into the questions that you all have either responded to in the Spotify Q&A or that you have emailed me. So someone asked, how important or necessary is a resume summary or like executive summary or objective? So I have my own opinion on this, and I'm sure that there are other people, other career coaches or, resume experts, let's say, who have a different opinion. But my belief is that it is necessary to have if you are changing industries, pivoting in your career, if your resume doesn't really speak to your strengths, for one reason or another, whether it's because you haven't had the exposure in title or like your titles don't match the exposure that you've had, like there are some like nuanced moments where that happens. And then I think the fourth reason to have it is if you are very, very, very experienced and the expectation and the standard is that you have an executive summary. To me, it's like most of the time, if someone has 15 or more years of experience, like that's a pretty standard part of a resume, because it's almost like a profile. And of course, it should be concise. It should highlight. It should be in the active voice, present and future tense. At no point in your summary should you be using the first person or I, me pronouns or whichever pronouns you may attribute yourself to. That's not typical or best practice, I would say, in a summary. If this does not apply to you, these like reasons for having an executive or objective resume summary, I should say, then you might fall into the category of having 0 to 10 years of experience, or maybe 0 to 5. Like maybe someone with 10 years of experience would be summing up their experience in a summary. But like if you really think about what the summary is for, it is really to explain if you're looking to make a change or pivot. It is there to explain your career goals. Like, for example, if someone is an HR business partner and they're trying to become a director because they've had the exposure in their business partner role because of the oversight that they've had, this would be a good way to leverage the summary, because the summary would allow a hiring manager to see in the resume that this person is looking for a larger title but has already had the experience. So to me, it's not a necessity at all. Even if someone has 20 years of experience, I do think that a resume, I think I mentioned this last week, but a resume should do a good job of identifying and highlighting your skills that you've acquired over the years throughout your career. So the summary should be used for a very, very specific purpose. And also it takes up space. So if you're going to have a summary, it should be, again, for a very specific purpose and for good reason. Someone asked, this is kind of similar to one of the tips that I had, which was not to include a picture. Someone said, should I include my address and in the section with my LinkedIn profile on the top of my resume? Do not include your address. You don't know who's reading your resume. I would love to think that normal, safe, non-dangerous people are reading resumes, but I just don't take the chance. I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm a mom now that I think this way, but I think I've always thought this way, honestly. Don't include your address. Just include city and state. So if you're in New York, just write New York, New York. You don't have to give your apartment number. What is the purpose for that? All of these questions are kind of answered with what is the purpose? Like, is the purpose behind providing your address because you think that that's required, or is it because you want to give more specificity to where you're located? Either way, city and state is pretty specific. So I just say leave it out. And actually every single resume or CV, depending on the person's profession and industry that I edit, I remove addresses. Phone number, of course, include that. LinkedIn profile, of course, include that. And also make sure your LinkedIn profile is formatted and added correctly. I know I mentioned that I saw a resume with an incorrect email. It was at gmail.co instead of at gmail.com. Just the other day, a client who I'm working with their resume, I'm working on their resume, excuse me. They had their LinkedIn URL, but it was not accurately or correctly spelled out. It didn't have the /in. And I understand, sometimes we think it's just linkedin.com/ whatever your URL is, but it's actually linkedin.com/in/HR Traci, for example. And this client did not have the /in. And so when you click the LinkedIn URL, it doesn't take you anywhere. It just says, oops, this link does not work. And so I told her that this was something that maybe was contributing to her needing to, not needing to, but basically contributing to her not getting interviews. Because even though LinkedIn is not everything, hiring managers do look at social media. They do look at LinkedIn, especially if they're active on LinkedIn, or if they need clarity on something that you've done or who you might be connected with, because maybe you worked for a company that they also worked for and they wanted to see who is a mutual connection. There's so many reasons why people look at LinkedIn. So just definitely make sure that those things are accurate too. Copy the URL when you're on your LinkedIn profile, not your news feed, but your profile. If you need more help on this, happy to guide you. This is a very similar question to something I kind of talked about last week. Are traditional resumes still relevant, or should I just be using Canva or something more creative? Traditional resumes are 1000% relevant. Like I said in last week's episode, they are the go-to and the norm for certain industries, and especially industries that are either antiquated or old school or conservative, or however you want to say it. Creative resumes are okay also. But again, I think I might have mentioned this last week, you have to really think about what is searchable and parsable by applicant tracking systems. For those of you who don't know what an applicant tracking system is, it is a tool that companies, especially that are a little bit larger, that companies use in order to acquire and retain and maintain applicants and all of their data. And there are companies that are under 100 people using applicant tracking systems. And then there are companies that have 10,000 employees globally who are using applicant tracking systems. And a lot of the larger companies are using ATS, applicant tracking systems, that leverage AI. So understanding the AI component, if you have a very creative, graphic heavy resume, those AI tools are not necessarily going to be able to read the information on your resume. So to give you a concrete example, if a company has an applicant tracking system and within that ATS system, they are screening resumes based on X number of years of experience or specific companies that they've worked for in the past because of competition or what have you, and you have a super creative resume that leverages graphics or tables, it will likely not parse that information out and you could end up getting passed over. Now, of course, if you're sending your creative resume to someone directly, that could be a good way to leverage something more creative. With my more experienced clients that I work with, I create for them profiles. So these are people who are C-suite or executives. And the profile is basically a one-pager that gives insight into their background and who they are, and kind of an overview of their skills. And that is kind of the perfect example of what would be passed around and potentially included also through an application, but passed around, especially when you're at that level, you tend to kind of really lean into your network more than anything. So that's kind of a good example, hopefully, of how a creative resume is leveraged more effectively. I've seen creative resumes submitted through ATS systems successfully and effectively, and I've helped clients create creative ones. It's just that this is something you might want to think about, especially depending on the industry, because you don't want to be cast out because your resume is too modern. That would be a silly thing to be looked over as a result of. How can I make my resume stand out, especially given the competition? This is a great question. I mean, I think I touched on this last week, but to me, the best way you can stand out is to make sure you don't have spelling and grammar errors on your resume, and to make sure that it's clean and readable, and that there are clean lines, and that you have a good font, and that it's professional. I know that might sound not realistic, or, other than unrealistic, it might sound vague, but that's really the truth, because I'm trying to think of resumes that have stood out to me. I've been doing some interviews for our open positions at my company, and there was a resume that I saw today that stood out to me. And I have to tell you, it was super traditional because of the person's profession. And even though we're tech and sure, we do things that are modern and maybe someone would have a creative resume, but it happened to be traditional. And what stood out to me was that there wasn't too much white space. It was super readable. My eyes went directly to this person's experience. The font was really nice. They used italics in certain places. Everything was formatted consistently. And it was one page, which is fine, but this, it's not good or bad. This person had 5 years of experience. That's appropriate. One page is exactly what you should expect from someone with that level of experience. And that resume to me stood out. In comparison to the other people that I had interviewed for this role, I would say it was pretty on par with their resumes also, with the exception that it was a little bit more easily readable. And to me, again, that makes the resume stand out. I can't tell you how many resumes I have seen either as part of an interview process or that I've seen as, someone who helps clients with these things, where the resume's biggest downfall is that it's not easily readable. Either there are a million words crammed into a section, or there aren't sections, or it's just too small a font or too large a font. And, it is kind of like an art and a science. But the best thing that I would recommend you do in order to test whether it's readable or not is you make the resume, walk away for 2 days. Don't look at it for 2 days, minimum. Go back to it, see what your eye is drawn to first. If your eye is drawn to awards, probably not the right formatting. If your eye is drawn to dates, probably not the right formatting. You want your eye to be drawn not only to your name, but also to your titles and experiences. I sometimes format resumes differently depending on the companies people have worked for, or depending on the roles that they've had. Most of the time, I like the title to stand out. But in some cases, people have worked for very esteemed companies, and depending on the industry, that's what really stands out. For example, if someone is in accounting and they've worked for a major accounting firm like Morgan Stanley or JP Morgan, it's not a terrible thing to have the clarity around the business that this person is experienced working in. And also it depends on if they've been promoted or have held multiple roles within that company. You really want to try not to fragment your experience. So if you've been promoted within a company, you should aim to format it where the company is shown once and you see the multiple titles beneath it. And then hopefully that's clear, but I'm trying, maybe one day I'll have to add some visuals here. So for those of you who watch on YouTube or Spotify can actually see what I mean. I can do either redacted examples or I can create fake resumes. But anyway, this next question is very important to me. So I want to get to it while I'm being mindful of the amount of time that we have left. And this is, should I explain the companies that I've worked for and what they do? This might be a personal thing, but I say absolutely not. And I've had clients before who really disagree with me on this, and they want to explain the companies that they've worked for and what those companies do or did. But again, the question is, what is the purpose of doing that? Is it more important where you worked, or is it more important what you did while you worked there? Now, I realize I just said that some companies are really important to highlight on your resume. To me, I worked at Target. To me, that was a very important distinction to make, that I worked for a major, a Fortune 500 company for almost 4 years. But just because you might call it out or make mention of a company you've worked for does not mean that you need to define what that company does. Again, ask yourself, what is the purpose of doing this? Is, in the framework of thinking about like clients that I've worked with who were pretty adamant about keeping those data points in, for example, having the definition of what the company does. Their feeling, if I'm recalling correctly, was that it gives insight into the industry and the scope of the role and things like that. But again, to challenge you, I ask, what is the purpose of that? Is there not a way that within your content you can build out that you supported 500 plus employees across North America? Is there not a way for you to build out the potential departments that you supported if you're a business partner, or what, depending on the job that you hold? All of that, to me, all of that can be built into your content, into your bullets. And it shouldn't be something that sits next to the company because, frankly, and please don't take this the wrong way, people don't really care. Like, there is some level of care in certain industries that applicants have experience in competitors or with competitors or in a similar market, or with specific companies. But even with that, you're not going to define those companies, because if you're applying to a job within an industry that is seeking, or within a job or a company that is seeking applicants who have had experience in particular companies, they don't need to know what that company does. They already know. So then it's like, well, if we pitch it in the sense of if you're switching or pivoting in your career, I still don't know that it's relevant. And I really don't know that people care to know what your company did. If anything, they would care more in the interview to see how things level and how things are kind of weighted compared to one another. This might be a hot take. I really don't know. I don't think it's a hot take, but I know that some people feel really strongly about including definitions or descriptions about the companies they've worked for. But I feel pretty strongly against it, actually. Yeah, pretty strongly. And, this last question is really around like common mistakes that I see that I would, suggest avoiding, but it really comes back to the spelling and grammar errors and typos, and really, again, like not being detail oriented enough, like having an error on your email or LinkedIn profile. Like those are things that just shouldn't happen. No one's going to care about your resume more than you, other than someone you hire to work on your resume. Like, I probably care about my clients' resumes just as much, if not more, than they care about their own resumes, right? So keep that in mind. And again, if you're interested in, working with me or getting some feedback on your resume, just shoot me an email at contact@hrtraci.com, or you can actually fill out a services request form on my website at hrtraci.com. Hopefully these tips and tricks and insights were helpful to you, because if you ultimately are not in a place to hire someone to help you with your resume, then take advantage of these tips, because realistically, most people can, hopefully do a really good job of working through their resume and making it as strong as possible. But there's definitely a market out there for people like me to help with resumes, because also most people don't really want to edit their resumes at all. They don't want to touch them. So I get that. And there are a few of us, but I definitely am a self-proclaimed nerd in the sense that I really love working on resumes. And so that's just something to think about too. I think most of the time errors on resumes come from people just really not wanting to spend the time. So that's something to think about. I think that, as we continue on in 2024, we'll probably continue to talk about resumes in different ways, and potentially talk about cover letters. I know I didn't touch on that, but there are some areas where cover letters are really helpful, and there are some areas where cover letters are totally unnecessary. And it really kind of depends on the company and what they need and what they're looking for. So if you have any other questions, I'm trying to think if there are any others that came through DMs, but I don't think so. I think that's everything. If you have any other questions, please make sure you reach out to me. I'm happy to kind of take a once over on your resume, give you some quick feedback in the hopes that it'll help you to be more competitive and stand out more when it comes to applying to jobs. In any case, please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're catching this episode. I have an amazing guest episode for you next week that talks all about compassion and communication and commitment and all of these types of things when it comes to humanizing the workplace. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram too at HRTraci. Visit my website, hrtraci.com. Rate, review, subscribe, and share it with a friend. Share this episode with a friend if it's going to be helpful to them, especially if they're trying to break into a new industry or get a new job. This hopefully will be helpful. All right, everybody, have a wonderful rest of your week, and I hope that you had a nice 4th of July if you are in the US like me. Thank you so much. See you next week. Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.